The morning sky over Helios Prime burned red as the alien ships came down like falling stars. Commander Mirai stood on the command tower balcony, watching her world die. The Calyx people had never known war. Their ships were built for exploration, their weapons designed for ceremony. They had no idea how to fight the monsters that now filled their sky. The Devourers had come without warning. One moment, the space around their planet was empty. The next, massive biomechanical ships appeared from nowhere, each one the size of a city. They moved like living things, their hulls pulsing with dark veins, their weapon ports opening like hungry mouths. Mirai pressed her hand to her temple, feeling the panic of her people through their telepathic link. Every Calyx could sense the emotions of others, and right now, terror flooded their shared consciousness like poison. Children were crying in the cities below. Parents held them close, not knowing what else to do. "Commander, the defense fleet is being destroyed," reported Captain Jinho, his mental voice tight with fear. Through the link, Mirai could see what he saw from his ship in orbit. The Calyx vessels, beautiful silver crafts that looked more like art than weapons, were being torn apart by creatures that defied understanding. The Devourer ships didn't just attack, they consumed. When their weapons hit a Calyx vessel, the metal didn't just break. It seemed to become infected, spreading darkness across the hull until the entire ship turned black and died. The crews inside screamed for exactly 3 seconds, then went silent forever. "Pull back the fleet," Mirai ordered, though she knew it was already too late. "Get as many people to the evacuation centers as possible." But even as she spoke, she watched something worse than ship destruction happening in the cities below. The Devourers were dropping pods onto the planet's surface. When these pods opened, they released swarms of small creatures that looked like insects made of living metal. These parasites spread across the ground like a plague, and wherever they went, life changed. The peaceful animals of Helios Prime, the singing birds, the gentle herding beasts, even the tiny flower pollinators, all became twisted versions of themselves. Their eyes turned black, their bodies grew sharp edges and claws, and they turned on the Calyx people who had cared for them for thousands of years. Mirai felt her heart breaking as she watched a group of children running from what used to be their pet companions. The beautiful gardens that surrounded every Calyx city were becoming hunting grounds filled with monsters that wore familiar faces. "The orbital defense stations have gone dark," Jinho reported. "The infection is spreading through our technology too. Everything connected to our networks is turning against us." Through her office window, Mirai could see the capital city's central spire beginning to change color. The biomechanical infection was climbing its walls like ivy, turning the white stone black. Soon even the buildings would become weapons against them. "How long do we have?" she asked. "Hours, maybe less." "The infection spreads faster near population centers. It feeds on our telepathic networks." Mirai closed her eyes and reached out through the mental link that connected all Calyx. She could feel millions of her people, their fear and confusion overwhelming. But she could also feel their love for each other, their determination to protect their families, their hope that somehow this nightmare would end. "Send the emergency beacon," she decided. "Commander, we've tried contacting the Galactic Coalition. They're too far away, and their fleets are already fighting Devourer attacks in other systems. No one can reach us in time." "Not the Coalition," Mirai said quietly. "The Forbidden Sectors." Jinho's mental presence recoiled in shock. "Commander, you can't mean—" "I mean exactly that. Get Captain Bora. Tell her to prep the fastest ship we have left." An hour later, Mirai stood in the launch bay with Captain Bora. The young pilot looked determined, despite the fear that radiated from her mind. Around them, the ship bay shook as Devourer creatures landed on the building's roof. "You know this is probably suicide," Bora said, checking her ship's navigation systems one last time. "Yes," Mirai replied, "but if you don't try, it's definitely suicide for all of us." Bora's ship was small and fast, designed for long-range scouting. It could make the jump to hyperspace quickly, and had enough fuel to reach the quarantine zones at the edge of known space, the areas where, according to galactic law, no one was supposed to go. "The beacon contains our entire history," Mirai explained, handing Bora a small device. "Everything about our people, our culture, our situation. If there's anyone out there who might help, they'll need to understand what we are. And if the stories are true, if the things in the Forbidden Sectors are as dangerous as the Coalition claims." Mirai looked through the bay doors at her burning world. "Then we'll find out if monsters can be reasoned with." Because right now monsters are all we have left to hope for. Bora climbed into her ship and sealed the cockpit. Mirai watched as the small vessel launched into the red sky, dodging between devourer creatures that tried to intercept it. For a moment she thought they would catch it. Then Bora's ship vanished into hyperspace, carrying their last hope into the dark. Back in the command center, Mirai coordinated the evacuation efforts as long as she could. The telepathic network was failing as more Calyx fell to the infection or were consumed by their transformed animals. The beautiful songs that normally filled their mental link were being replaced by screams and silence. By nightfall, half the planet was dark, not destroyed but changed into something alien and hostile. The infected zones pulsed with a sickly light, and Mirai could hear new sounds echoing from them. Mechanical sounds, like vast machines being born. "Commander," one of her surviving officers reported, "we're getting strange readings from the outer system. Something's happening to our gas giant." On the display screen, Mirai watched in horror as their system's largest planet began to collapse. The Devourers weren't just taking their world, they were harvesting their entire solar system, turning planets into raw material for their incomprehensible machines. As she watched her people's ancient home being consumed, Mirai wondered if Bora had made it to the forbidden sectors. She wondered if anyone was listening in that dark space beyond the galaxy's edge. And she wondered if they had just invited something even worse than the Devourers to their dying world. But as the command center's lights began to flicker and change color, as the infection finally reached their last stronghold, Mirai decided that any answer was better than none. Even monsters might have mercy. Even monsters might care that somewhere in the dark children were crying for help. 3 days after Captain Bora's ship disappeared into the forbidden sectors, something answered. Admiral Doha was leading the Galactic Coalition rescue fleet when her sensors started showing impossible readings. She had been racing toward Helios Prime with every available ship, hoping to arrive in time to save at least some of the Calyx people. But as her fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the system, she found something that made her blood run cold. Ships were already there. Ships that weren't in any database. "Admiral, we're getting contacts at bearing 27 Mark IV, her sensor officer reported, his voice uncertain. "But they're not showing up on long-range scans. They're just appearing." Doha stared at her main screen as the unknown vessels came into view. They were nothing like any starship she had ever seen. While Coalition vessels were smooth and efficient, these ships looked rough and angular, like they had been grown rather than built. Their hulls were dark gray metal that seemed to absorb light, and they bristled with weapons that pulsed with barely contained energy. "Size estimate?" Doha asked. "That's the problem, Admiral. Our computers can't seem to decide. One moment they read as frigate-sized, the next as dreadnoughts. It's like they exist in multiple dimensions at once." The largest of the unknown ships was moving toward Helios Prime, and as it traveled, space around it seemed to bend and twist. Stars in the background looked stretched, and Doha's navigation officer reported that his instruments couldn't track the vessel's exact position. "Admiral, we're receiving a transmission," the communications officer announced. "It's on all frequencies at once somehow. Put it through." The voice that came through the speakers was calm and pleasant, speaking in perfect galactic standard. But there was something about it that made Doha's crew shift uncomfortably in their seats. It sounded too human, too normal for something coming from those impossible ships. "Greetings, Coalition Fleet. I am Captain Taekwon of the Earth Expeditionary Force. We received a distress call from this system and came to help." Doha felt her heart skip a beat. Earth, the quarantined world that every military officer learned about in academy classes. The planet whose coordinates were locked away in classified files, surrounded by warnings in 17 different languages. "Unknown vessel," Doha transmitted back. "This system is under Coalition protection. Please identify your authorization codes and state your purpose." There was a pause. Then Captain Taekwon's voice returned, and Doha could swear she heard amusement in it. "Our authorization comes from a species that asked for help. As for our purpose, we don't like it when children cry. It makes it uncomfortable. Sir, I need proper credentials before I can allow—" "Admiral," Taekwon interrupted gently. "Have you ever heard of the Andromeda incident?" Doha's mouth went dry. Every spacefarer knew about Andromeda, an entire star system that had simply vanished from spacetime 30 years ago, leaving behind only empty space and radiation that hurt to look at. The official report claimed it was a natural phenomenon, but the classified version told a different story. "You're claiming responsibility for Andromeda?" Doha asked. "Not responsibility. We were asked to clean up a problem that was spreading beyond that system. We did what needed to be done." On her tactical display, Doha watched as more Earth ships appeared around Helios Prime. They didn't emerge from hyperspace like normal vessels. They simply became visible, as if they had been there all along but hidden from sight. Each ship was different, and each one seemed to violate several laws of physics just by existing. "Admiral," her science officer whispered, "I'm reading massive gravitational anomalies around those ships, and the energy signatures are off the charts. I've never seen anything like this." Doha opened a private channel to her fleet commanders. "All ships maintain distance and defensive posture. Do not engage unless fired upon." But even as she gave the order, she knew her weapons would be useless against ships that could make stars disappear. "Captain Taekwon," she transmitted, "I'm requesting immediate consultation with Coalition Command before we proceed." "Of course, Admiral. Take all the time you need. But while you're talking to your superiors, we're going to get started. The people down there have been screaming for 3 days, and we can't listen to that anymore." Doha watched in fascination and horror as the Earth ships moved toward the infected planet. The Devourer forces, which had seemed invincible just hours ago, began to respond to the new threat. Biomechanical ships that had destroyed the Calyx fleet without effort turned their weapons toward the approaching humans. What happened next defied everything Doha knew about space combat. The Devourer ships fired first, launching streams of the same infection that had consumed Helios Prime, the biomechanical plague that turned everything it touched into twisted versions of itself. Struck the lead Earth vessel directly. Nothing happened. The infection hit the ship's hull and simply stopped spreading. It didn't bounce off or get destroyed. It just stopped, as if it had forgotten how to be infectious. "Impossible," Doha's science officer muttered. "The Devourer plague consumes everything. It's adaptive, it learns from whatever it encounters." "Maybe it met something it couldn't learn from," Doha replied quietly. The Earth ships began to return fire, and their weapons were unlike anything in the Coalition database. Instead of energy beams or projectile weapons, they seemed to fire concepts. One Devourer ship was hit by something that made it forget how to exist in 3 dimensions. Another was struck by a weapon that convinced its biomechanical systems to evolve backwards until it became a simple asteroid. "Admiral," her communications officer called, "we're getting a message from the planet's surface. It's from the Calyx survivors." "Put it through." The voice was weak but filled with wonder. "Coalition fleet, this is Commander Mirai. The invasion? It's stopping. The infected areas are returning to normal. The Earth ships, they're doing something to the Devourer forces that we can't understand. It's like they're talking to the infection and telling it to go away." Doha stared at her tactical display as the battle for Helios Prime unfolded. The Devourers, who had seemed unstoppable just hours ago, were retreating. Not defeated in conventional combat, but somehow convinced to leave. Their biomechanical ships were powering down and withdrawing toward the outer system. "Captain Taekwon," Doha transmitted, "what exactly are you doing down there?" "Clean up, Admiral. The Devourers are very old and very angry, but they're not evil. They're just trying to survive in a universe that's become hostile to their kind. We're helping them understand that there are better ways to exist. You're communicating with them, in a manner of speaking. We have experience with ancient hungry things. We know how to speak their language." Doha realized with growing unease that the quarantine around Earth hadn't been to protect the galaxy from human aggression. It had been to hide something that could casually negotiate with forces that consumed entire civilizations. "Admiral," her sensor officer reported, "the quarantine boundary around the Sol system, it's gone. The energy barriers that have contained Earth for centuries just disappeared." Doha looked at the impossible ships moving around Helios Prime, like guardians protecting their young. She thought about Captain Bora's desperate flight into forbidden space, carrying the cries of a dying people. And she realized that the galaxy had just changed forever. Earth's monsters were no longer contained. They were loose among the stars, and they had apparently decided that the universe needed protecting. The question was, protecting from what? Or protecting for whom? The real battle for Helios Prime began at sunrise on the 4th day, when the Devourers realized that the Earth ships weren't going away. Lieutenant Hyunwoo sat in the cockpit of his fighter, watching the dawn light reflect off his ship's hull. His vessel looked normal enough from the outside, but he could feel its alien heart beating in rhythm with his own. The Coalition would call it technology, but Hyunwoo knew better. His ship was alive in ways that regular people couldn't understand, and it was hungry for the fight ahead. "Reaper Squadron, this is Control." Captain Taekwon's voice came through the comm system. "The Devourers are massing for a final push. They're bringing up their deep space variants. Remember, we're not here to destroy them. We're here to convince them that there are better places to feed." Hyunwoo smiled as he launched from the carrier. His wingman, Sergeant Jiwan, flew beside him in a ship that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. From Admiral Doha's fleet, the human fighters probably looked like they were teleporting randomly through space. The truth was more complicated than that. The Devourer attack came like a living storm. Biomechanical fighters poured from the larger ships, each one a fusion of metal and flesh that adapted to whatever it encountered. They had learned from their battles across the galaxy, incorporating the best features of every species they had consumed. Hyunwoo dove into the swarm, and his ship responded by becoming something that the Devourers couldn't quite see. He wasn't invisible, that would be too simple. Instead, his fighter existed in a state between dimensions, solid enough to fire its weapons but ghostly enough that enemy fire passed harmlessly through it. "Having fun over there, Hyunwoo?" Jiwan's voice crackled through the comm as her ship appeared inside a Devourer formation. Her fighter seemed to be in 6 different places at once, firing from angles that made geometry professors cry. "The usual," Hyunwoo replied, phasing through a biomechanical interceptor that tried to ram him. As he passed through its hull, he whispered something in a language older than recorded history. The Devourer ship shuddered, its biomechanical system suddenly remembering what it had been before the infection changed it. Confused and frightened, it powered down and drifted away. Down on the planet's surface, the ground war was even stranger. Corporal Subin moved through the infected zones like she was taking a walk in a park. The biomechanical parasites that had turned Helios Prime's wildlife into monsters swarmed around her, but they couldn't seem to decide what she was. Her armor looked normal enough, standard Coalition design with some modifications. But the creatures trying to infect her kept dying the moment they made contact. "Subin, what's your status?" Major Donghei's voice came through her helmet comm. "Just explaining to the local wildlife that they don't actually want to be monsters," she replied, kneeling next to a creature that had once been a Calyx family pet. The animal was covered in biomechanical growths that pulsed with alien energy. But as Subin touched it gently, the infection began to fade away. The creature looked up at her with eyes that were slowly returning to their natural color. It made a soft sound, not the mechanical screech of the infected, but the gentle purr it had made when it was just a beloved companion. "How are you doing that?" Commander Murray's voice came through the local comm network. The Calyx leader was hiding in an underground shelter with the last group of survivors, watching the impossible battle unfold on her screens. "We're not doing anything special," Subin replied, moving to help another infected animal. "We're just reminding them what they really are underneath all the anger and fear." Major Donghei led his squad through the ruins of the capital city, where the biomechanical infection had turned buildings into living weapons. The structures around them pulsed with alien heartbeats, their walls lined with sensors that tracked the humans' movement. But instead of attacking, the infected buildings seemed confused. "Team, remember what we learned about ancient biotech," Donghei said as they approached the central spire. "It's not evil, it's just scared. It's been running from something for so long that it forgot how to be anything except a weapon." He placed his hand on the wall of the infected building, and the biomechanical growth under his palm stopped pulsing. The alien infection had encountered something it couldn't categorize, something that existed outside its understanding of possible life forms. "What are you?" Donghei whispered to the infection, and somehow it heard him. The response came not in words but in images flooding his mind. He saw the birth of the Devourers billions of years ago, when their galaxy was dying and they had to choose between extinction and becoming something that could survive in the cold void between stars. He saw their endless hunger, not for destruction but for connection, for the chance to be part of something living again. "I understand," Donghei said softly, "but this isn't the way. These people didn't choose to be part of your story. You're taking their choices away." Around him, his squad members were having similar conversations with the infected technology, not fighting it, not destroying it, but explaining why it needed to find a different path. The biomechanical growth on the buildings began to change color, from the sick green of infection to something warmer. The alien technology was learning a new way to exist. Back in space, Admiral Doha watched the battle with growing amazement. The human ships weren't just winning. They were transforming the entire conflict into something else. The Devourer fleet, which had seemed invincible just hours ago, was slowly backing away from Helios Prime. "Admiral," her science officer reported, "I'm reading massive changes in the biomechanical signatures. The Devourer ships are evolving, but not into better weapons, into something else entirely." On her screen, Doha could see it happening. The biomechanical ships were changing shape, their weapon ports closing, their hulls taking on new configurations. They were becoming exploration vessels, science ships, maybe even hospital ships. The infection that had consumed them was learning to be something other than a plague. "Captain Taekwon," Doha transmitted to the lead human ship, "what exactly are your people?" The response came with that same gentle amusement she was beginning to recognize. "We're what happens when a species survives something that should have killed everyone in their star system, Admiral. We learn to exist in ways that make the impossible seem normal. And the Devourers, they're what happens when a species chooses survival over everything else. But they're not lost. They just forgot that there are other ways to live." As Doha watched, the transformed Devourer ships began to move away from Helios Prime. But they weren't fleeing in defeat. They were leaving because they had remembered something they had forgotten long ago, that survival didn't have to mean consuming everything around them. The biomechanical infection that had covered half the planet was fading away, leaving behind landscapes that looked healthier than they had before the attack. The twisted creatures were becoming normal animals again, and the infected buildings were turning into something beautiful and strange. "Admiral," Commander Mirai's voice came through the comm, filled with wonder and fear in equal measure. "The humans are offering to help us rebuild. But their definition of rebuild is very different from ours. They're suggesting improvements that shouldn't be possible." Doha looked at the human ships moving around Helios Prime like protective parents around their children. She realized that the galaxy had just encountered something that could casually rewrite the laws of biology and physics when they got in the way of protecting others, and the monsters Earth had sent weren't monsters at all. They were guardians. The terrifying part was realizing that if beings this powerful considered themselves protectors, what were they protecting the galaxy from? By the third day after the battle began, the last of the Devourer ships were leaving the system, but they weren't fleeing in defeat. They were departing as something entirely different from what they had been when they arrived. Captain Taekwon stood on the bridge of his ship, the Inevitable, watching the transformed biomechanical vessels move toward the outer system. Where once they had been engines of consumption, they were now something closer to mobile ecosystems. Their hulls green with new growth, their weapon ports replaced by what looked like gardens. "Captain," his navigation officer reported, "the Devourer command ship is requesting permission to approach." "Granted," Taekwon replied. "Let's see what they've become." The massive, biomechanical vessel that approached the Inevitable was barely recognizable as the same ship that had led the assault on Helios Prime. Its hull pulsed with warm light, instead of the cold energy of infection, and its surface was covered with structures that looked more like coral reefs than weapons. When the communication came through, it wasn't the mechanical screech that the Devourers had used before. It was something closer to music, translated into concepts that human minds could understand. "We remember now," the message said. "We remember what we were before the hunger took us. Thank you for helping us find ourselves again." Taekwon smiled. "You were never lost. You just forgot how to be full instead of empty. The young species, the calyx, we caused them pain. How do we repair this? You help them grow stronger. You share what you've learned about survival without consumption. You become gardeners instead of harvesters." The Devourer ship pulsed with warm light that somehow conveyed gratitude. "We understand. We will find others like us. Others who have forgotten how to be anything except hungry. We will teach them what you taught us." As the transformed Devourer fleet departed for the deep void, Admiral Doha finally worked up the courage to approach the human ships directly. She had been watching from a safe distance for 3 days, but her curiosity was stronger than her fear. "Captain Taekwon, requesting permission to come aboard your vessel," she transmitted. Of course, Admiral. Bay 7 is open for you. Doha took a small shuttle across the space between her flagship and the inevitable. As she got closer to the human ship, her instruments began giving readings that made no sense. The vessel was the right size according to visual inspection, but her sensors insisted it was simultaneously much larger and much smaller than it appeared. Landing in the shuttle bay, Doha was surprised to find that it looked completely normal. Standard docking procedures, breathable atmosphere, gravity that felt natural. It wasn't until she was walking through the corridors that she began to notice the details that were wrong. The shadows fell in directions that didn't match the light sources. The walls seemed solid when she looked directly at them, but from the corner of her eye she could swear they extended much further than they should, and the crew members she passed looked human until she focused on them, at which point her brain insisted they were something else entirely. Captain Taekwon met her in what appeared to be a standard ship's conference room. He was a tall man with kind eyes and a gentle smile, wearing a uniform that looked like it had been designed by someone who had only heard descriptions of military clothing. He seemed completely normal until Doha noticed that his reflection in the table's surface showed something with too many angles. "Admiral, welcome aboard," he said, his voice carrying that same unsettling warmth she had heard in the transmissions. "I hope you'll forgive the accommodations. We're still learning how to make our ships comfortable for non-human visitors." "Non-human?" Doha asked, confused. Taekwon's smile widened slightly. "I'm sorry, that was a poor choice of words. Non-Earth human visitors. You see, the terms human and possible have very different meanings where we come from." As if to demonstrate his point, Dr. Hanyul entered the room carrying a tray of refreshments. She appeared to be a pleasant woman in her 30s, wearing a standard medical uniform, but as she moved, Doha noticed that the space around her bent slightly, as if reality had to make room for her presence. "Dr. Hanyul is our xenobiologist," Taekwon explained. "She's been working with the Keelix survivors to help repair the damage from the biomechanical infection." Dr. Hanyul set down the tray and casually reached into empty air, pulling out what looked like a complex medical device. "The infection was quite sophisticated," she said conversationally while manipulating what appeared to be dark matter with her bare hands. "It was designed to rewrite biological systems at the quantum level. Fortunately, quantum biology is something of a specialty for us." Doha stared as the doctor continued to work with impossible materials, as if they were everyday tools. "How are you doing that?" "Oh, this?" Dr. Hennel looked at the dark matter device in her hands. "It's quite simple once you understand that the laws of physics are more like suggestions. Useful guidelines for most situations, but not really binding if you know how to ask politely." "We don't mean to be disturbing," Taekwon added gently. "It's just that our definition of normal has been influenced by some unusual experiences." Doha decided to ask the question that had been bothering her since the human ships first appeared. "What happened to Earth? Why were you quarantined?" Taekwon's expression became more serious. "Our sun was dying. Not naturally, something was killing it, draining its energy for purposes we never understood. We had two choices: evacuate our system and become refugees, or find a way to survive what was coming. You chose to survive. We chose to adapt. The process changed us. We became something that could exist in ways that most species would consider impossible. The quarantine wasn't to protect the galaxy from our aggression, Admiral. It was to hide us until we were needed." "Needed for what?" Dr. Heno looked up from her impossible device. "To protect the children, of course. When species cry for help, someone has to answer. And sometimes the things threatening them are so far outside normal existence that only other impossible things can deal with them." Doha felt a chill run down her spine. "There are others? Other threats like the Devourers?" "Oh yes," Taekwon said softly. "The Devourers are actually quite gentle compared to some of the things moving in the deep void. There are entities out there that make consuming civilizations look like a minor hobby. And you can deal with these. Entities? We can communicate with them, negotiate, sometimes fight if necessary. But mostly, we try to help them remember what they used to be before they became hungry or angry or afraid." Doha thought about the ease with which the humans had transformed the Devourer fleet from a plague of consumption into something beautiful and alive. "What do you want in return for your help?" Taekwon looked genuinely puzzled by the question. "Want? We don't want anything, Admiral. We save people because that's what you do when someone is crying for help. It's not a transaction, it's just right. But surely there must be some cost. Some price. The only price, Dr. Handel interrupted gently, is that the galaxy will have to get used to the idea that Earth is no longer quarantined. We're going to be around from now on, helping where we can. As if to emphasize her point, an alarm chimed softly in the conference room. Taekwon touched a control panel that seemed to grow from the table's surface. Captain, we're receiving distress signals from the Kepler Rim, his communications officer reported. Multiple species reporting attacks by something they're calling Star Eaters. Taekwon sighed. How many systems affected? 17 so far, sir. And the pattern is accelerating. Doha watched as the human captain's expression shifted from gentle concern to something much more serious. Prepare the fleet for departure. Set course for the Kepler Rim. Captain, Doha said, those systems are weeks away, even with the fastest coalition ships. Taekwon smiled that unsettling smile again. Admiral, you're still thinking in terms of normal space-time. We'll be there in 6 hours. As Doha prepared to return to her own ship, she realized that the galaxy had fundamentally changed. The quarantine around Earth was gone and humanity was loose among the stars. They claimed to be protectors, guardians who responded to cries for help. The terrifying question was, if beings this powerful were needed as protectors, what exactly was hunting in the dark between the stars that required such impossible guardians to stop it? And why did Doha have the feeling that the Devourers had been just the beginning? 6 months after the battle for Helios Prime, the galaxy looked very different. Commander Mireille stood in her rebuilt office, looking out at a city that shouldn't have been possible. The Helix capital had been reconstructed with human help, and the results defied every rule of architecture she knew. Buildings curved in ways that seemed to add extra space inside them. Gardens grew in midair without any visible support, and the whole city hummed with an energy that felt alive and welcoming. Her people were thriving in ways they never had before. The biomechanical infection that had nearly destroyed them had been completely reversed, but the humans hadn't just restored what was lost. They had somehow made everything better. Plants grew more vibrantly, animals were healthier, and even the Helix themselves felt stronger and more connected to each other than ever before. The morning reports. Commander, her aide said, handing her a datapad that projected information directly into the air above it. Another impossible piece of human technology that they had shared freely. Mirai read through the updates with growing amazement. Food production was up 300%, despite using less land than before. Birth rates were climbing as her people felt safe enough to start families again. And most remarkably, their telepathic abilities had grown stronger, allowing them to communicate across interstellar distances. Any word from the deep space monitoring stations? She asked. All quiet, Commander. No sign of Devourer activity anywhere in this sector. But we are getting some interesting readings from the old battleground. Mirai looked at the data and smiled. Where the final battle had taken place, space itself seemed to have been changed. Ships passing through that area reported feeling a sense of peace and protection, as if something benevolent was watching over travelers. Some Helix pilots claimed they could hear faint music when they flew through the region, the same kind of harmonious sounds the transformed Devourers had made when they departed. Across the galaxy, Admiral Doha was writing her final classified report from a hidden research station. Her investigation into the human intervention had revealed things that kept her awake at night. The Devourer threat hadn't just been stopped, it had been completely eliminated from the galaxy. Not destroyed, but transformed into something beneficial. The biomechanical plague that had consumed 17 star systems over the past century had been turned into a healing force that now helped damaged worlds recover from disaster. But that was just the beginning. Ancient threats that had plagued the galaxy for millennia were disappearing one by one. The void whispers that drove entire species insane had gone silent. The reality storms that randomly deleted star systems had stopped forming. The shadow fleet that appeared every few centuries to steal entire populations had simply vanished. Each time, Doha wrote in her report, the pattern is the same. Distress calls reach certain coordinates, and then human ships appear to deal with the threat. Not just defeat it, but somehow convince it to become something else entirely. She paused in her writing, thinking about what she had learned about Earth's true nature. The quarantine hadn't been about containing human aggression. It had been about hiding them until the galaxy needed guardians who could exist outside the normal rules of reality. Recommendation, she continued typing, establish permanent communication protocols with Earth forces. They appear to be our best defense against threats that conventional military forces cannot handle. What she didn't write in her official report was her growing suspicion that the humans had known this day was coming long before the first distress call reached them. They had been preparing for centuries, becoming something that could stand against forces that existed beyond normal space and time. In the deep void between galaxies, Captain Taekwon stood on the bridge of the inevitable, watching his crew prepare for their next mission. The ship's sensors were picking up distress signals from regions beyond the galactic rim, places where no known species lived, but where something was crying out in languages older than recorded history. Captain, his navigation officer reported, we're receiving the same signal pattern from 47 different locations, all beyond the edge of known space. Taekwon studied the pattern on his screen. It was familiar. The same kind of desperate plea for help that had brought them to Helios Prime, but multiplied dozens of times over. Something vast and ancient was spreading across the void between galaxies, and the few remaining species in its path were sending out calls for anyone who might be listening. Set course for the nearest signal, he ordered. Alert the fleet that we're moving to deep space operations. Sir, his communications officer said, Admiral Doha is requesting permission to accompany the fleet with coalition observers. Taekwon considered this. The Admiral had proven herself trustworthy during the Helios incident, and her people deserved to understand what was happening in their galaxy. Permission granted, but warn her that where we're going, the rules of normal existence become flexible. Her people might find the experience disturbing. As the human fleet prepared to leave known space, Dr. Hanul was in her laboratory, working on something that would have given coalition scientists nightmares. She was carefully growing a new type of space-time, designing reality that could exist in the voids between galaxies where normal physics broke down. How's the Habitat project coming along? Taekwon asked, visiting her lab before departure. Quite well, she replied, gesturing to what looked like a small sphere of swirling light. This should provide a stable environment for any refugee species we encounter. It's designed to adapt to whatever kind of existence they're most comfortable with, even if they exist in ways that shouldn't be possible. Dr. Hanul smiled. Captain, by now we should know that impossible is just another word for unusual. Whatever we find out there, we'll figure out how to help them. The human fleet departed known space quietly, without fanfare or official announcements, but their leaving was noticed by species across the galaxy, who had learned to watch for signs of their protectors' movements. On Helios Prime, Commander Mirai felt a gentle touch against her mind, a telepathic message from Captain Taekwon himself. We're going to help some neighbors who live very far away, the message said. We'll be back when we can. Take care of each other while we're gone. Mirai sent back a message of her own. Thank you for teaching us that monsters can be kind. We'll be here when you return. As the human ships vanished into the deep void, something else was happening across the galaxy. Species that had never made contact before were reaching out to each other, sharing resources and knowledge. The Helix telepathic network was being extended to include other species who wanted to join a broader community of mutual support. Trade routes were being established not just for profit, but to ensure that no world would ever face crisis alone. Defense pacts were forming based not on military strength, but on the promise to call for help when needed and to answer when others called. The galaxy was learning the lesson that Earth had taught through actions rather than words, that the strongest civilizations were those that protected others, not just themselves. In the deepest archives of the coalition military, Admiral Doha filed her final report with a single conclusion that would reshape galactic policy for centuries to come. Earth's quarantine has ended, not because they have become safe, but because we have become worthy of their protection. They are no longer hiding from us, they are standing guard over us. The question is not whether we can trust them, but whether we can become the kind of galaxy that deserves guardians who would travel across impossible distances just because someone was crying for help. As the months passed, more distress signals would reach the galaxy from the deep void, and each time the same calm voice would answer across the cosmic dark. We hear you. Help is coming. Earth's children were no longer waiting in the shadow of their quarantine. They had become the light that answered when others called out from the darkness, proving that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones who care too much to let evil go unanswered. The galaxy had learned to cry for help, and Earth had taught it that someone would always be listening.